Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Christy Nicholas.
So, Christy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. So, can you tell me about what you've written?
Well, I've written 2 travel guides, one on Ireland and one on Scotland, a 9-book historical fantasy series called The Druid's Brooch, which is set in Ireland, a paranormal adventure called Call of the Morrigu, a retelling of an Irish fairy tale called The Enchanted Swans, a time-slip romance called Past Storm and Fire, a time travel adventure called Time Tourist Outfitters, and a contemporary romance based on my parents' 30-year search for true love, which is called Better to Have Loved. And it's on sale right now for 99 cents.
Well, that is so amazing. You've written a lot. Wow. So actually, circling back to the one about your parents, how did you go about writing that?
It was my first novel. It's what actually inspired me to start writing novels to begin with, because the story had to be written. The basics of the story is that my mother and father fell in love and had a mad, passionate affair back in the 60s, as you do.
Mm-hmm.
He went back to his wife, and without knowing that my mother was pregnant.
Oh.
So she raised me as a single mom. And when I was about 9 years old, I started searching for him. When I was 30, I found him. So 21 years of searching. He had been divorced. He had no idea he had a child. He was thrilled. He and Mom got back together, and they got married on the Starship Enterprise in Las Vegas and got married and are living happily ever after. So I had to write that.
Oh my gosh. As you're saying this right now, you can't see me, but I'm like, my jaw's dropped. Like, that is the best story. Wow. So how did you, and that's such like a big undertaking too, because it spans so long.
The trying to extract data from my mother's 30-year memory was challenging.
Yeah.
So I made a lot of stuff up because I novelized it.
Yeah.
I made it into a story a novel based on a true story rather than an actual memoir. And the first time I wrote a sex scene, it was my own conception.
Well, so that had to be awkward.
If I could do that, I could do anything.
Yeah. I mean, like, yeah.
I actually knew some particulars about it. I knew that they used a B&B bathroom because both of them shared their rooms with other people and they had no other place to be private.
Oh my.
So, there's fuel.
Yeah. But wow, that is so incredible, because on your website I had read that you wrote something about your parents' love story, but I thought that you meant that you just drew inspiration from their love for other novels. Wow.
Well, my mom was a hippie. She went to Haight-Ashbury in 1967 and hung out there in the hippie scene for a while. And she went to London, and she went to Scotland, and she went to Denmark and Spain. So she was a globetrotter. Wow.
That is so incredible. So when you were writing it, did you write it from like your perspective or perspective looking back? How did you make that decision?
I did both. I didn't make a decision.
Oh.
I wrote it. My mom's the main character, but there's a dual timeline, and there's me as a child and then growing up and becoming the investigator. And it goes back and forth between the 2 timelines.
Oh, that sounds so fascinating. I'm definitely going to have to read this book, and I recommend that everyone listening to this also read that.
I've also got it in audiobook.
Oh, everyone also listen to that.
I say it was my first novel, and it was, but I just got the rights back from the original publisher, and I republished it myself with new edits. So all the things that I've learned in the past 7 years about writing, I've applied.
Nice.
Because it was really rough the first time.
Oh, yeah, I've done that where I've had to rewrite whole books. Going, yeah.
Oh, this was horrible. Why did I do that?
Oh, no. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you found any particular ones that in all of your writing that like you looked back on from what you did a few years ago and went, well, that was embarrassing or anything like that?
Everything that I've looked at.
Oh,
Well, I'm currently in the process of getting my Druid's Brooch books back as they come due. So each one's on a 5-year contract. And the first one came back to me last year, and I rewrote it and made new covers and audiobook and re-released. And again, I realized how much I'd learned in the intervening years and tried to up my craft, so to speak. So I'm going to be doing that now for the book 2, which is coming back to me in July of 2021, and so on throughout the series.
that is amazing. So
It'll be a process.
yes, as a writer, do you feel like you're constantly kind of like rewriting stuff?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And like, yeah.
As I go to sleep, I think of refinements to the current project I'm working on, and I grab my phone and email myself a quick note so I can remember it.
Yeah. So you mentioned that
when I'm driving.
Oh yeah.
What's that?
So you mentioned that you wrote a retelling. Can you tell me a little
Yes.
bit about that and like about the kind of research that you had to do into that original story?
Sure. The Enchanted Swans is a retelling of an Irish fairy tale called The Children of Lear. Now, that's the story of 4 children whose mother died, and their father married the mother's sister, their aunt. Now, their aunt was very jealous of the love that the father had for the children and turned them all into swans for 900 years.
Oh.
Yeah. And the story doesn't have a happy ending because the Irish love their misery. And they cling to it with a strong grip.
Yeah.
I searched everywhere for a non-Christian ending to this tale because this is a very old tale. But every version I found, the children only became human again when the Christian church bell rang and they became blessed as Christians.
Oh.
But the tale starts 900 years before Christianity came to Ireland. So I tried to find a pre-Christian version, and I just couldn't. I looked at original sources, and even though I don't speak Old Irish, I know people who do, and nobody could find anything.
Oh my. Yeah, like I've heard a lot been learning a lot about how a lot of the mythologies and stories have been so dramatically changed because they've been Christianized when Christianity came to especially like
Christian
Ireland.
veneer over it. Yeah.
So what did you do in the end?
In the end, I did have the Christian element, and they did turn back into humans with the Christian help. But it was both a help, in my tale, it was both help of the Christian and the pagan magic combined. They both had to be there in order for the curse to break. So I made it a cooperation.
That's a clever way of doing it. I like that you preserved both tellings in a way. Like, yeah. So when writing your Druid's Brooch series, did you plot out how many books it would be beforehand? And like, did you go into it knowing that it would be multiple?
When I wrote the first one, this was the first book other than my parents' novel that I'd written. And my parents' novel was set in the 60s, which isn't my favorite time period. But I love Irish history. So I thought, okay, this is my chance to shine. I get to write about something I love. And I started researching it, and I had fun writing it. And then I thought, I want more. So I didn't write the first one knowing that there would be more, but after the first one, I plotted out the other 8 and determined when they were going to be and what their main character was going to be like and what the conflict was and what sort of magic was in it. And so I plotted the rest of the series out after the first one.
Okay.
And they go backwards in time. So the first one is 1846, and the main character is Valencia, and she searches for her great aunt Esme. The second book is in 1800 about Esme as a young lady, and she gets help from her grandfather Aemon. The third book is in 1746 when Aemon was a young man. So it keeps going back and back and back in the same family.
Oh, that sounds so cool.
And they all have a magical artifact called the Druid's Brooch. And it gives its holder a type of magic, and it's different for each holder, but it has to be within that family.
How was the decision-making process in making the books go backwards? Because that's such an interesting thing that I don't see very often.
Well, after I wrote that first book, I decided I wanted more, but in 1846, going forward, I didn't see all that much forward, and that character had played out. She'd done what she needed to do. Mm-hmm. So I decided that Esme was an interesting character. Let's see what happened to her. And so, yeah, that's where that idea was born. And I wanted to get to the origin of the Druid's Brooch, which is book 9.
Oh.
Where it all came from, how it came to be.
Oh, that sounds so fascinating. So you've mentioned before, like looking in your like about sections on your website, that you are an artist and that like your family has a lot of art in it. How did you blend like your roots in that world into your writing?
When I was growing up, my mother's an artist, my grandmother's an artist, great-grandmother was an artist. I grew up with my mother and my grandmother, and with my grandmother being an art teacher, I was exposed to a lot of creativity. We sculpted, we drew, we painted, we did needlepoint, we did calligraphy, we did all the things. Mm-hmm. So when I was growing up, she taught me how to look at the everyday beauty, how to look at a leaf that's fading in the autumn and see the colors, how to see the rain or the mist coming up from the rain and see how beautiful it is. And when I started getting into photography, that just intensified more because I was looking specifically for things I could capture and share with other people. So when I was writing, I discovered that I have a very cinematic way of writing. I love setting scenes and painting a vivid picture with my words. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people who read my stuff say that I'm very cinematic, that they can picture exactly the scene in front of them. And that's how I see it when I'm writing. I see the movie in my brain, and I'm just transcribing what's happening.
Oh, I do too.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you know what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder if anyone else experiences this, please write into the show and share it with us. Because, yeah, it's interesting being able to see everything that's happening.
You can see where the characters are standing and what they're doing and the expression on their faces. And you can feel the rough texture of the wooden table underneath their hands. And you can smell the flowers that are in the vase. And, all those sensual pieces fit in together.
When you see something so vividly like that, do you ever feel like the characters can move of their own accord within your story?
Characters elbow their way into the story when I'm not even looking.
Do you ever get frustrated by them? I'm like, no, you're not supposed to do that.
Well, I'm a planner, which means I plan out my scenes, my acts, my everything, fairly. Every scene has a descriptor as to what happens in that scene. Now, when I'm actually writing the scenes, one scene can become 8 can become 1. A new character can come in that I didn't even expect to be there and take over half the book. That's exactly what happened with Past Storm and Fire. I was a third of the way through the book when this character, one of the antagonists, the antagonist's mother, who I didn't even consider before, she was there and she gave the main character a charm to protect her from attack. And she became a mentor. I didn't know she was going to be there.
Oh. Yeah, I always find that phenomenon so interesting because a lot of the authors that I've interviewed on here have had that same thing where it's like the characters just do what they want.
Yeah. Get back in your box.
Yeah.
They never do.
So Can you share any tips on striking the balance between history and fiction when writing historical fiction?
That is something I struggle with every single book. Now, I write fictional characters in the historical world, as opposed to Sharon K. Penman or Elizabeth Chadwick, who writes historical figures in a historical world. They write about, Henry VIII and William Marshall, and people whose names we recognize. I write people I've made up that might interact with a historical figure, but they're not the main characters. So that gives me a lot more leeway as to how my characters will act. However, I do exhaustive research as to where they are, when they are, what they'll eat, what they'll wear, how they'll act. None of this 20th century attitudes in 12th century Ireland.
Yeah.
There may have been one or two, but it was not normal for a woman to, speak out against her husband or run away or, things like that. It was just, I realized that it's difficult to have sympathy for somebody in a different society with a different sense of mores and values, but that's what historical fiction is. It's seeing that other world and seeing how other people deal with that society, with that time period. And it helps give us a perspective on what we take for granted, I think.
And how far we've come, too.
Yeah.
And in some ways, how far we haven't come.
Exactly. So there is a name that we use in modern day called Tiffany. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows a Tiffany, right? There's even a jewelry store. It's not a modern name. In ancient Greece, they had Theophania. And even in the 12th century, they had a Tiffany with an IE on the end in France, in the records. It's an old name. Usually girls being born near the Feast of the Epiphany were named Tiffany. But if I put a Tiffany in the 12th century, my readers would say, oh, that's such a modern name. I was just thrown out of the book. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
But it's historical. It just doesn't seem historical. It doesn't have that feel to it. So people won't believe it.
So when you're writing, do you try to avoid those things or do you try to stay as accurate?
I try to make it a non-issue. Most of the names that I choose, like for 12th century stuff, because I have 3 of my novels are set in the 12th century, I look through the records of ancient Ireland to find people who actually were named in the records so that I have real names. I try to find names that sound to modern ears, male/female, depending on the character, or if there's a character that is gender fluid, I've done 1 or 2 of those. I try to choose one that works with that. I try to choose names that are not too difficult for modern American readers to pronounce.
Oh, yeah.
With Irish names in the 12th century, that's not that easy.
Yeah, and especially trying to avoid things like the name Tiffany, which sound modern. Yeah.
Well, like an ancient Irish name, Kevin.
Oh.
But it's spelled Caoibhan.
Yeah.
Which isn't going to fly with American readers. That's actually not how it's spelled, and I don't remember how this actual spelling is, but that's the point. It's not an American spelling.
Yeah.
I do put a pronunciation guide in every one of my books with Irish names and Irish words, but it's still difficult to deal with.
Oh, yeah. That happens to me a lot when I'm reading. I'm like, oh, this name, and I totally romanticized it in my head based off of the spelling, and then somebody explains to me what it actually is, and it's like, what? Oh, well, that's a normal name.
I remember growing up reading Anne McCaffrey's Pern books, Dragon Riders of Pern, and my favorite character was Menali. And then I met Anne McCaffrey, and she said, no, it's Manali. I'm like, oh, but It's in my mind already. I can't make it change.
Oh yeah, I read one and I did not know what the name Jocelyn was for some reason. I was like 7 or 8 and I read it. I had this, I don't even remember what I had said, but it was something totally ridiculous that sounded nothing like Jocelyn. It might not have even had a J in it. And my mom was like, that you realize that's not this character's name. And I was horrified.
Early trauma.
Yeah. Well, it's when you're writing too, that's just a testament to how great your writing is if you paint such a vivid picture that you bring the readers in.
Yeah, I try. I really do. I know it's one of my strengths, so I try to play up to it.
Yeah. When you're plotting out scenes, do you think like, ooh, how can I make this feel almost cinematic?
That's when I'm writing a first draft, only about a third of my scenes come out cinematic first time. It's in my second draft that I go in and fill in the ones that aren't. Because sometimes I get into Zoom mode when I'm writing, and I get the action and the dialogue out because that's what I'm seeing, and I'm seeing it, I'm seeing it, I'm seeing it, and I'm writing too fast. That's when I'm getting 2,000 words a minute out of my fingers.
Whoa.
Yeah. But those are the scenes that are very bare in terms of the description and scene setting. And so on my second draft through, that's when I'll fill that in.
How many drafts does it usually take you?
I usually do one full draft straight, and that usually takes me about 6 weeks to 8 months for a 100,000 word book. I write like 2,000 words a day. I set myself a minimum. Then I do another full draft, filling in the bits that I hurried through, checking my consistency, things that I ended up with in the end that I hadn't remembered from the beginning, and I try to tie in all the loose bits. Then I go through and do a grammar edit using Pro Writing Aid, getting rid of all my overused words and minimizing my passive sentences and stuff. Then I send it off to beta readers, and I edit and rewrite some more. And then I send it to a second set of beta readers and edit it some more. Then I send it to a professional editor and edit some more, and then proofreading. And then I record the audiobook, which catches the final, hopefully, errors. Because when you read it aloud, you find more.
Oh, yes. Yes, reading aloud is the hardest thing, too, because have you ever found it where you're like, oh my gosh, this is the clunkiest sentence?
Yes.
But you had no idea when you were writing it.
Exactly, because when you read it out loud, it's a completely different process.
Yeah.
And I figured if I'm going to read it aloud to catch the errors, I might as well record while I'm doing it.
Yes. Okay, so unrelated, but when you travel to Ireland, do you find that it inspires your writing?
Oh, absolutely. I've been there 5 times. Supposed to go a 6th time in last May, but that didn't happen because of COVID. And even the first time I went there, as soon as I got there, I felt completely at home, completely grounded. Every place I go, every person I meet, every historical site that I visit gives me more ideas. And even though I visited before I started writing, because I only started writing about 7 years ago. Yeah, Better to Have Loved, I started writing 7 years ago, and 7 years ago was my last visit to Ireland. So I'd been 5 times before that. I still use the places I've visited in a lot of my stories because it's so much easier to visualize where everything is in relation to itself, other things, if you've actually been there. And Google Earth is great, but it can only do so much.
Yeah, definitely. Since you said that you felt like this connection to it immediately, does that
Absolutely.
help you, like when you're writing your stories, knowing like these characters have this as their physical home, but like for you, like when you were there, it was like almost like a spiritual home, kind of?
Yeah, I could absolutely get behind that idea. Ireland is a place that captures my imagination. And because I use my imagination to write, it's the safest place for me to write about. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah.
Now, I have written other books in other places, Scotland, Iceland, Maine, even Mali,
Yeah.
Toronto.
Um, so you've written travel guides for Ireland and
Yes.
Scotland as well. Can you tell me a little bit about the research process you had to do for those?
Well, as I said, I've traveled several times, including to Scotland, England, Wales, and Iceland. And every time I travel, I write a very detailed travel log. Every time I sit down to eat, I write, who I met, what I ate, what rocks I tripped over, my impressions, what problems we had, what joys we had, etc. And I'd always been doing this, and I wrote them both for my own use later so that I can remember these things, but also to share it with other people. And then I started giving advice to other people for their trips to Ireland, and I decided to write up a guide. And took a lot of the information that I'd gathered from my various trips, did a lot more research in places that I hadn't been in Ireland, and wrote together a couple guides. Now, it was very coincidental that at the same time I'd made Facebook friends with somebody, another author, who used to be a travel guide in California and now lived in Ireland and had just started a small press publishing firm. So she was willing to take my hand and guide me through the process and help me publish my travel guides.
That is so awesome. So you mentioned very early on in this interview that you've written romance before, and like you've written like the one like with your parents and stuff like that. How do you create characters knowing that you want them to be together in the end?
That's hard because I don't consider myself a great romance writer. I don't read a lot of romance because a lot of it to me is very cheesy and contrived, and that annoys me. I like the more realistic ones that where they bump their heads when they lean into kiss and
Oh yeah,
things like that. And that's what I tried to do with mine. I tried to make it slow burn. I don't,
yes.
not love at first sight or anything like that. I try to throw in problems and conflict, but not just, they didn't tell me something and therefore now we are fighting forever. It was especially difficult with the Past Storm and Fire one, the time slip romance, because there were really several romances going on. The main character is in modern day Miami, and she's writing about a character in Iceland that she's kind of projecting herself into. And the Iceland character is in the romance with two brothers, a triangle. But the person that's writing it is in a bad marriage trying to get out. And ends up meeting somebody that's helping her research. That is very much like the person that she's writing that's her character's in love with. So,
oh, that's really interesting. But I could imagine that would be tricky to try and write and make sure, like, how did you go about making sure they were different enough, but still similar?
And she even calls out the fact that she had written this character before she met the researcher, and they look very similar, and their names are almost exactly the same.
Oh.
But she wrote him first.
Oh, that's cool.
Now, in the book, she is researching this character that she wrote, and she realizes that it's a real character, a real person, a historical person. But the character she's projecting herself as, she didn't realize existed. She finds her own character's name on a gravestone, married to this guy.
Oh my gosh. Now, I'm definitely gonna like immediately go look up your books to go get them, because
that one is Past Storm and Fire.
So incredible.
And it starts off in 1992 in Miami during Hurricane Andrew.
I recommend that everyone listening to this go and get all of these books, read all the things, go to your libraries, buy them, and support her because this sounds so good. Okay, well, I've got one last question, and that is, how do you curb writer's block?
So I've never actually experienced writer's block. I have had days when I don't want to write and I push through it anyway, knowing that the writing is crap and it's going to get edited later. Because all a first draft has to do is exist. So I guess that's how I deal with it. I push through it. I know that what I'm writing is wooden and the conversation is bad and the scene might get deleted, but I'm writing. And usually the next day the flow comes back.
Yeah. Do you have any tips for getting back into that flow? Like, do you have anything that you do specifically?
Write anything. Write a poem. Write a short story. Go on Reddit and find an idea from all the ones that they throw out there and just write something on it. I actually saw an idea today that I saved in my idea file because I want to write it.
Oh.
And it's about let me see if I can pull up it was either a Tumblr blog or Reddit. It was Tumblr. Cafes don't have clocks because they are timeless spaces. There's a cafe in my town called Time, and it has clocks all over the walls, but none of them are the same or the right time. That cafe is an entry to the fairy world. Do not eat or drink fairy food, but have you tried their lattes? These are different comments. And then it goes on to talk about how a cafe is fine because you're exchanging something, and the whole thing about taking a fairy food is taking a gift and therefore having an obligation. But if you take a free sample that they offer, that's something else. So now I want to write a set of short stories set in this Fae cafe.
Well, that sounds incredible. Now I want to go to the Fae cafe.
Yeah. And this is like right up my alley. This is like urban fantasy set. I could set it in Ireland.
Oh, that sounds so cool. And Tumblr always has the best ideas.
Yeah. Well, Time Tourist Outfitters was actually out of two different Tumblr posts that inspired me.
Oh.
And one of them was, why is it always a teenage chosen one saving the world? Why not a grandmother with knitting needles going on crusade? Someone with life skills. So I made a...
Oh, I never thought of that.
And then the other one was talking about, nobody ever talks about the people who have to give the time travelers costumes. You've got this woman running a costume shop. They said, 16th century Elizabethan? I'm going to need 3 weeks notice on that, Karen. Do you have any idea how long it takes to make ruffs? Or really hand-painted silk kimono? Well, I know what I'm going to be doing all night. And those two posts made me write Time Tourist Outfitters, where she's running a time-traveling outfitter shop, and she runs on caffeine and sarcasm. And she's a 55-year-old woman with life skills, and she has to come out of retirement and go on another time mission because all the other time agents are getting ill with a plague. And yes, I read this a couple of years ago.
Oh my gosh. That sounds so amazing. Yeah, wow. So I take it that you like using prompts and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Even the current whip I'm working on, it's an urban fantasy series, kind of like X-Men Go to Ireland. And it was prompted by a post how really all the people that have amazing talents have fae blood in their history. Like Freddie Mercury has a siren somewhere in his ancestry. Or Michael Phelps, mermaid. Okay.
Oh, yes.
And so my whip is a bunch of people who, after the magnetic poles shift, the iron in their fae ancestry blood is no longer held back. Or the fae blood is no longer held back by the iron in the world because of this magnetic pole shift. And these talents, they had the talents, but now they're super talents. So Michael Phelps becomes a merman in a couple months' time.
Oh my gosh.
And so you've got a bunch of people with these burgeoning powers, and there's protests against them, and there's a pure earther movement.
Oh,
and
no.
So they all run to Ireland, where there's a much higher percentage of people because their Fae tradition is so much stronger and so much more recent. And so there's 40% of the people in Ireland have these talents, whereas 10% is the rest of the world.
This sounds so incredible. Like, all of these ideas that you've been saying are like right up my alley. I'm totally going to go and I want to read all of this.
Well, this one, I've only written 1.5 of the trilogy so far. I've written the first one and I'm halfway through the second one.
Amazing.
So hopefully, I'm trying to get all 3 of them out sometime later this year.
That's incredible. Well, I wish you luck. One last thing before you go, and that is, what do you have coming up?
What I just mentioned.
Yeah.
I will have, I'm going to start rewriting the second book of Druid's Brooch for re-release. I'm working on the urban fantasy trilogy that's called The Unhidden, maybe The Unhidden Souls, I think I'm going with the trilogy name. And I'm also writing a nonfiction book called Extreme Planning for Authors.
Amazing. All
I've
right.
got about 90% of the first draft done on that.
Excellent. Well, once that comes out, I hope that everyone listening to this, anyone who's a writer, will go out and get that. Everyone will read her books. Thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. I had a wonderful time.
For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Christy Nicholas.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end. Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.